We knew that we had information that could save lives, could prevent the spread of disease, that could be very useful to people. And now the law basically had said, and you can't tell anybody.
Hi, data and AI friends. We are at a generational shift. Some might even say a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. To capitalize on this opportunity, you need more than just great technology. You need a mindset shift. That's why I'm proud to say that ThoughtSpot sponsors this podcast. Go from raw data to trusted insights and action with ThoughtSpot Agentic Analytics, a platform powered by a suite of specialized AI agents. It's why companies like Cisco, Lyft, T-Mobile, Sephora, and Schneider Electric count on ThoughtSpot. See what the future of analytics looks like at thoughtspot.com. Welcome to the Data and AI Chief. I'm your host, Cindy Housen. Many of you have shared with me that you tune into the podcast while you're out walking, jogging, gardening. The question is, how are you capturing that data? Your heart rate, your steps, your recovery? Today, you get to hear from Emily Capodilupo, Senior Vice President of Research, Algorithms, and Data at WHOOP, the wearable device revolutionizing how we understand our bodies. Emily is an award-winning AI and research leader, and she actually joined WHOOP as its first employee. She founded and now leads the company's science organization, pioneering a new model for health that starts long before illness. In this episode, you'll learn how WHOOP is redefining what health data can do and what's standing in the way of turning that data into real-world impact, and how AI and wearables could bring personalized healthcare to everyone. Emily, welcome to the Data and AI Chief.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. And I had the privilege of hearing you speak and meeting you in person in Davos, which was super inspiring. So where in the world are you joining us from today?
Nowhere near as cool as Switzerland. I'm in Boston right now.
Okay, well, Boston's pretty cool along the waterfront there, of course. Now, Emily, you have such a fascinating background. You are a certified EMT. You studied neuroscience at Harvard, and you've ended up as WHOOP's first employee. Tell us about that journey. What's the connecting of the dots here?
I thought that I wanted to be a doctor, and I always loved and was fascinated by how we work in human physiology. And so the first thing you can possibly do on the journey was becoming an EMT. I got certified as an EMT when I was 17 years old. I loved everything about EMT school, and then actually becoming an EMT was like a really weird, rude awakening where it was like nothing like what we had learned in the training. And then when I actually became an EMT, it was like 14 out of 15 calls never should have interacted with the healthcare system or the first responder system. And sort of all of the health emergencies that are related to medical noncompliance, or even when there's intent to comply, like you can't afford your medication, but you want to take it. It just felt like almost everything was completely avoidable. And so I got really obsessed with this idea of both how do you keep people healthier, but also why is the system failing us? Fast forward 2 years, I was at Harvard, and I got really obsessed with human sleep. I think the summer before my freshman year of college read that, despite the fact that we spend a third of our lives sleeping, nobody actually knows why. And that was the most interesting. I couldn't get that thought out of my head. There's nothing we spend anything close to a third of our lives doing that we don't know why. And it just so happens that Harvard has one of the largest, oldest, and most respected sleep labs in the world. And so I cold emailed them my freshman year, and I was like, I must work with you. I'm fascinated about what you're doing. And I got a job, and I'm so grateful to Elizabeth Clerman for hiring. And during most of this time, I also thought that I still wanted to be a doctor. I started and ran Harvard's student-run EMT service, and I got an ambulance up and running that still exists today, so an entirely student-run EMS service. And I loved that work. That's where I really got the startup bug, hence WHOOP. Because that process of going from 0 to 1 and making something happen got really, really exciting. And then fast forward, I take this class by David Cutler, who was Obama's senior healthcare advisor, and he started talking about sort of why these problems that I'd been really struggling with as an EMT happen. So why is it that so many people who want to take their medications can't afford them? And why is it that, it's thousands of dollars when an ambulance comes to your house? So like, why is it that, so the sort of economics of this emergency event that was entirely unavoidable are just absolutely enormous when you start to also include all of the externalities. And so I ended up working for Michelle Obama. I went to Chicago and I worked for this healthcare consulting firm that she created. And I got really interested in just this idea that like we should be able to keep people healthy. We should be able to keep people out of the emergency room. And so I get back to campus for my senior year, having spent the summer thinking about issues of like everything that needs to exist before you call 911. How do you keep people healthy? And so much to my parents' disappointment, did not apply to medical school. Oh. Instead, like in all of this process, ended up meeting Will Ahmed, WHOOP's founder and CEO, who, because I was studying sleep and knew that sleep was going to be an important part of what WHOOP did, was like, you need to come work for me. I was like totally bitten by the startup bug at this point, totally obsessed with this idea he was pitching of how do we intervene long before they get sick. And I was just like, this is exactly what the world needs. It felt like there was just this enormous open space for a company like WHOOP to come in and fill a missing gap.
Yeah, so many threads there to pull on. One is your fascination with sleep and the opportunity really for preventative care and some of the data. I also will just make an observation that it was very brave of you just to pitch or pursue. I'm going to work with you in the sleep lab. There's not many students that would be that bold at that point. So I think that's wonderful. So now I have to ask you, Emily, really important, how many hours of sleep do you average?
My 6-month average is 7 hours and 39 minutes a night. And that's of actual sleep, not just time in bed.
Okay, that's awesome. Because I would dare say that many co-founders and startups, they're not getting that kind of sleep. There's a bragging culture for how much you can do on so little sleep. I will say I do average more than 8 hours if we're not counting jet lag. And I think you and I shared, I no longer have a cup of coffee after 12 o'clock because of the research on how it messes you up. So now you have the data, and you have more than a decade of the data on the benefits of sleep. What is the take here? Is it driving behavior change?
One of the things that I found so interesting about sleep was like the more we kind of experience sleep as if I don't sleep, I get sleepy, right? And that was why I found this, this thing that I read 20 years ago now that was like, we don't actually know why we sleep. So interesting because it's like we get uncomfortable when we don't sleep, but nobody really knows why we do it. We do know that if you don't sleep for about a week, you die. So something really important is happening. And when I was working in the division of sleep medicine at Harvard, I happened to have a desk that was right outside the office of this guy, Orfeo Buxton, who to this day I think is just one of the coolest researchers ever. So he was studying the relationship between diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular disease and insufficient sleep. And one of the things that several people at the Division of Sleep Medicine were working on was basically this idea that like people who don't get enough sleep die of everything at higher rates. And some of the things feel really obvious, like they die of car crashes, right? Because they fall asleep at the wheel. Like that like makes a ton of sense. why that would happen. But why is it that they have, poorer metabolic health and so they're diabetic at higher rates? Why is it that they, have every kind of cancer at higher rates? And so particularly true around shift workers, who are some of the most underslept people, which is also just like, I think it's something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 Americans are shift workers. There's like an enormous rate of adults are doing this. We celebrate busyness as a culture, right? We celebrate being important and having stuff to do, and praise people for being productive despite sleeping. And so we create this culture of somehow associating, if you're getting enough sleep, like you either are lazy or you must not.
Yeah.
And I think one of the culture shifts that I've seen over the 13 years that I worked at WHOOP is that the culture is starting to recognize like wellness and the importance of sleep, but it's still one of the first things that people give up when they get ambitious in other areas. And it's so important to get enough sleep for every area of functioning.
So you capture sleep data, but of course the WHOOP device captures a lot more than that. Blood pressure, for example, and other respiratory data points. And this goes back to the origin story of WHOOP. Take us back in time. Who were the primary users that you were designing the product for originally?
Yeah, so WHOOP's origin story is basically that our founder CEO, Will Ahmed, was the captain of the Harvard squash team. And in total plain view of the team and all of his coaches, he worked harder than everybody else from the moment he became captain, right? So he was showing up to practice early. He was working harder during practice. He was staying late. And the whole time it was just praise on praise on praise on like, look at that work ethic. You're working so hard. This is amazing. And then, of course, like he had a horrible season. And what he didn't realize and what people weren't realizing sort of for him, like this whole system that, this is not only a D1 program, but a national championship team. So these are, the best coaches money can buy, an incredibly difficult team to get on. So these were not underskilled coaches. It was just nobody realized that he had gone too far. And he overtrained. And that's the worst, right? If somebody loses to you because they don't work as hard as you do, like that seems somehow fair. A bad season maybe ended up being the greatest thing that ever happened to him because it's what sparked WHOOP. But he started really digging into like, what just happened to me? How could somebody have known that I had gone too far? When should I have stopped? Everybody knew what he was doing. It wasn't secretive or anything like that. And they just didn't know to tell him to stop. And so he ended up kind of doing all this research on what could have told me to stop, and started wearing like a polar chest strap, which is like an ECG-based chest-worn wearable that has been around for about 45 years at this point. And was just like, I want to like understand these signals. I want to understand what my body could have said. And that's sort of what turned into WHOOP, was this idea of we're going to help people understand what their limits are so they go up to them and get the maximum benefit that their body can actually convert into a training stimulus and use to get fitter, but stop them from like going over that hump. Because the reality is like more is more for almost everybody. Like when you're talking about like the couch to 5K, the people doing nothing, it's like more is more. And then there's like this, okay, when you get to be this like really high performer athlete, more starts to become less, where it's like, because it comes at the expense of sleep, it comes at the expense of recovery, it becomes really hard to fuel properly. And so all of a sudden you start beating up your body without the commensurate ability to recover. And so it just becomes damage. And so because we were targeting this really high-end group of people who are at risk of overtraining, not like sort of what everything else was targeting at the time, which was like, let's help motivate people to get off the couch. Let's do our first 10,000 steps. You have to keep in mind all of this is years before the first Apple Watch came out.
Right.
But so like the first handful of people on WHOOP after Will's squash team and some friends and family and employees were like LeBron James, Michael Phelps, so really, really early WHOOP users, because we were targeting the best of the best who needed permission to slow down, because they had abundant motivation, and would often like kind of find themselves like fighting with their coach about, whether or not it was a good idea to keep going, because they wanted to get that edge and do more, and they had the time for it, and they had, all the energy, and their coaches were saying like, no, you need to rest. And
Yeah. And so I think about the injury prevention that that different product view has. So let's go forward a few years. We're in the pandemic. You're capturing this range of data, some of which includes respiratory data. And you, as you shared in Davos, it's a discovery that it can be used as an early warning sign for infection, which sounds amazing. And you would think everyone would want this. What happened?
Yeah, so we had been tracking respiratory rate for a couple years at this point, in large part because one of WHOOP's core algorithms that, we developed maybe 5 or 6 years earlier around tracking what stage of sleep you're in. Respiratory rate helps you differentiate among like REM sleep and light sleep. And so we had added this years ago to help us sleep. We didn't really have a great user-facing story around respiratory rate, like why you were supposed to care. So it was like in the product for a long time. Nobody was really talking about it or paying attention. But then all of a sudden COVID comes around and, it's a respiratory tract infection. And so as what was unique and interesting about COVID, which was also part of what made it so dangerous, was that in the original strains, the modern ones behave actually a little bit differently, but the original one had about a 14-day asymptomatic but contagious incubation period. And so you'd get infected and the virus was like building up in your body. You wouldn't report any symptoms, but because it was in your lungs, when you kind of coughed or breathed out, you were spreading it. That's a little bit different from a lot of other viruses because often when they're pre-symptomatic, they're also not yet contagious. And so that's why people were like spreading COVID without realizing it. And hence the need for social distancing and all that kind of stuff that we all remember from 6 years ago. But what was interesting is that even though you were pre-symptomatic, your body was starting to compensate. And so what we saw during that 14-day period was that your respiratory rate, which is normally one of like the most boring vital signs ever, like it does not do anything. It just like it'll be a perfectly flat line for people on video. I can like just show you mine. It does nothing night overnight. Like to the 10th of a breath per minute, it'll just be exactly the same. But all of a sudden it was like spiking up 50% or 40%. And then all of a sudden we were seeing it spike up out of nowhere. And then sort of 3-4 days later, people would report, the classic COVID symptoms and feeling sick. And so what we realized was that if we were monitoring your respiratory rate, we could tell you that you're showing this sign of like incubating, but in this like compensating phase when you're not reporting any symptoms, that you're likely contagious. Encourage you both to social distance during that time, as well as to give you the heads up that you're about to get sick so that you can like be prepared for that, right? Like get some food delivered or whatever it is, you can hunker down and, get everything you need in order so that you can kind of handle that. But it was sort of an interesting time because this was the first time ever that WHOOP had something that was very acutely relevant to people, but it met the FDA's definition of a medical device because it was diagnostic. Everything else we had done had been like very, very squarely in what the FDA has very clearly articulated as wellness and therefore not regulated, not considered medical and obviously regulated by like sort of FCC type stuff, but not as a medical device. And we work with a lab at Central Queensland University basically to demonstrate that the algorithm that we had for detecting COVID was incredibly accurate. We were able to show that we could detect COVID up to 3 days before symptom onset in over 80% of cases. And we applied to the FDA for something called emergency use authorization, which would basically allow us, it's like a fast track for medical devices when there's an emergency situation. And there were lots of products and things being granted EUA, emergency use authorization, during this time for the pandemic because nothing existed. It was a brand new virus. And we were saying, like, we can do this. We would like to be able to tell members that, we've detected something, and the sort of value of giving somebody a warning, if we're right, is so much greater than like the cost of overwarning if we happen to be wrong, that this felt like an incredibly low risk, safe thing to do.
Very low risk.
Yeah, like,
Very low risk.
we're not.
Rather than close schools, shut down the economy, this, in a rational frame of mind, maybe this is just, if you have it, self-isolate. So what happened?
Yeah, so the FDA denied the application, and it left us in this really uncomfortable situation because obviously we didn't want to violate the rules of the FDA. Like, we deeply respect the law, but we just published this paper. We were the first wearable to do so, and we believed in our algorithms, third-party tested and all that kind of stuff. We knew that we had information that could save lives, could prevent the spread of disease, that could be very useful to people. And now the law basically had said, like, and you can't tell anybody.
And you can't tell anybody. Oh boy, oh boy.
So, like, we can't say your data suggests you have COVID.
Okay.
We're sort of sitting there scratching our heads a little bit about, like, this feels like morally problematic and uncomfortable. And then the PGA ended up, they were the first sports organization to reopen. If you think about it, golf is like the perfect social distancing sport because there doesn't need to be any contact with that. So the first sport to open back up, and they buy Whoop for everybody, all the caddies, all the athletes, anybody involved. And they do this mass Whoop rollout. And they decide that they're going to have their first PGA competition after, a period of shutting down for the pandemic. And they swab everybody, the like PCR tests. And Nick Watney, who was one of the PGA athletes on Whoop, tests negative. He wakes up the next morning when they're supposed to play, and his Whoop respiratory rate spikes. He feels fine, but he had heard some of what we had gone through in terms of about this paper that had been published, because we'd done a little bit of press around the algorithm when we published the paper. And so he tells his coach or trainer, I forget who, that he needs to get retested. They tell him he's crazy. He tested negative yesterday. He can go play. And he's like, no, I need to get retested. He gets retested, tests positive, and he's COVID. And so all of a sudden he's telling the story about how, Whoop Whoop detected something that the PCR test didn't, prevented him from playing when he could have gotten people sick, which allowed us more or less to not have to claim it, but let him tell the story. And so the word kind of got out that you can track your respiratory rate as a hint as to whether or not you might be incubating a presymptomatic case of COVID. And people started to rely on that.
Yeah, that was a strange time in the world. And if ever, it reinforces the point that it's culture, not logic, that can influence decisions, or culture more than data can determine how rationally we behave. But you also had another study, really important, about cognitive decline and the difference between sleep and some of your HRV data, and the link to Alzheimer's. So I can either really do expensive blood tests that's not picking up some of the early signals, or I can use this less invasive data. What did this tell you about the role of wearables in clinical research?
Yeah, we did a study back in, I think it was 2017, 2018 with Weill Cornell. And we looked at people who are not yet diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but were considered high risk, usually because they had a genetic or family history of it. And we tracked them at 2 different time periods, I think about a year and a half apart. So we did cognitive testing for dementia, and we looked at their sleep over the period in between those. So you can look at any measurable decline in cognitive performance. And the idea of the study was to see if there were any differences in sleep that explained the differences in disease progression. And what was really interesting is that there were differences in slow wave sleep between essentially like the people who progressed more and progressed less. Now, what that study didn't show, and more research is definitely needed to understand, is less slow wave sleep causing the dementia, or is dementia causing less slow wave sleep?
Oh, yeah. Correlation, not causation. Yes.
So the direction of causality, if there is one, was not determined by the study because it wasn't sort of interventional in that way. But nonetheless, it did demonstrate that changes in sleep architecture were correlated with changes in cognitive performance. And so, whether or not you could intervene on the sleep directly to change the outcome, it does suggest that monitoring sleep architecture over time could be an early warning sign, especially for people who aren't otherwise getting, regularly screened, that there might be an associated cognitive performance decline, and so could help triage people to who needs to be retested sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And so these are just a range of potential use cases for wearables in preventative health. Where do we stand with the FDA now?
We do have FDA-cleared products now, and more in the works. And, we deeply respect the work that they do. And I also, I have to imagine that during the pandemic, they were just flooded and there were things that they couldn't make time for. They didn't so much reject our application on its merits as they were just like, we can't like deal with this right now. And it just never got like the attention. In retrospect, we were a relatively small company at the time, and I'm sure they were dealing with other things. And
yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. But I just want to congratulations on the FDA approval. I think this is where then it gets really interesting as a preventative tool. We've talked a lot about the data. Tell us a little bit more about the role of AI in all of this. You referred to a few algorithms, but elaborate more on the role of AI here.
Yeah, I mean, there's AI. It means a lot of different things at WHOOP, right? There's, the algorithms that detect these things are one flavor of AI, and we've been doing AI the entire 13 years that I've been at WHOOP. I think too many people think that OpenAI invented AI with the ChatGPT 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and that's obviously not the case. But, we did partner back in 2022 with OpenAI to bring like a lot of those advances in natural language into the product. And one of the ways that like AI has advanced the product in a way that feels like AI to the end user is this like ability to chat with WHOOP in natural language, the way you might chat to a doctor or a trainer or a coach, and make WHOOP a bit more accessible for people who don't think well in terms of graphs and data and just want to ask questions and get, English or any of 200 different language answers back. And so that allowed us to serve a much broader and less technical audience. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about chat is it sounds like AI feature, you would think that that's for techies, but it's actually like the way less technical people that love like our most technical features, because it abstracts away a lot of that tech. We also build a lot of our own AI models and are leveraging the fact that, WHOOP has been collecting data over 12 years, and we just have an absolutely enormous data set. And so we're working on a lot of new types of algorithms that are able to detect things and help people understand their bodies in ways that we might not have appreciated were possible even just a couple of years ago.
Yes. Well, as I shared with you, I'm not a total Luddite, but I did order my WHOOP and ordered one for my husband too. I figure we should be teammates in this. And one of the things that I am both excited and afraid of, an innovation that you were excited about, is the Healthspan. So tell our listeners more about that.
Yeah, so our Healthspan feature came out last May, And it's sort of two features in one. So its goal is to help you understand, you can think about it as like a biological age. So the primary score for Healthspan is an age that maps to what your equivalent risk profile for all-cause mortality risk is. So if your WHOOP age is younger than your chronological age, that means that you have a similar risk to somebody younger than you of dying, which is a lower risk because Gompert's law tells us that your all-cause risk of mortality after age 20 goes up by 10% per year, sort of indefinitely. So there's this nice linear relationship. And if your WHOOP age is older than your chronological age, then your risk of all-cause mortality is equivalent to somebody older, so therefore higher. And we break it down into like 9 different components to help you understand behaviorally what you are doing that is either making you older or younger. We also have this like companion score to the Healthspan metric called pace of aging, which looks at your more recent 30 days, and it tells you based on the last 30 days, essentially, are you pacing towards your age increasing or decreasing. So while your WHOOP age is this more comprehensive, holistic picture of all your behaviors over a longer period of time, we also want to make sure that you don't get surprised that it's going up or down. And so this pace of aging metric keeps you accountable on a shorter 30-day period.
Yes. So I look forward to digging into this. I am just anxious that it might tell my husband he's 10 years younger, and I'm 10 years older than my real age. So,
there's so a couple things. I would be surprised if your husband was that young, although good for him if it does. But there's an incredibly interesting study on smoking where they looked at smokers, and like smokers have been told forever, right? Like you're gonna die, and they don't change behavior. And the likelihood that you quit smoking if you were given a like lung age score was something, I forget the stat, but it was like orders of magnitude, like multiples more likely to and like stay quit versus if you were just told the standard, like you're very likely to get lung cancer.
yeah.
Because people don't make sense of that. And so there's a lot of really good user behavior and psychological research that these ages are super motivating. And it's actually become our most screenshotted feature. Like people love it. And it helps them make sense of kind of, I have my sleep score here, and my exercise score here, my stress score here, my blood pressure here. And like WHOOP is collecting an enormous amount of data, but like all in, how am I doing? And so the goal of Healthspan was to give you like one North Star and just say like, all in, like, the pluses and the minuses kind of cancel each other out a little bit, but here's where you've landed. And, it's funny, our CEO declared, he's like, I'm never turning 30, and like I'm just gonna keep and I had a goal of like, keep having my chronological or like my WHOOP age be 25 before my chronological age hit 35, which I achieved, which is great. But like it's really motivating to have like one thing that helps you understand how the different behaviors trade against each other. And I personally find it really motivating because I'm like, if I can keep my WHOOP age, 10 years younger than my chronological age, then that should translate to being in a situation where I can show up as like the type of very active, very physical, very capable grandmother that like, my kids would be comfortable leaving their kids with because, even if you love your parents, if they can't lift your kids, they probably can't help all that much in case of emergency.
Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to let listeners and what is the real age and what is the WHOOP age and the disparity with my husband and me. But you also referenced, Emily, the vast amount of data. And so we have to talk about privacy and trust. And maybe if you frame it not just in the WHOOP context, but the overall wearables and how we can have better trust so that it really can be used for preventative medicine. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, WHOOP takes data privacy and trust incredibly importantly. Like we take this very, very seriously. The data is, it's encrypted end to end. And when we're doing research and using the data It's always done in a de-identified way. So, and when we do research, we're doing things like getting IRB approval and making sure that we're following, good clinical practice and best practices and things like that. So this is something that's incredibly important to us. And we know that it takes 13 years to earn the trust and one mistake to lose it.
Yes.
So that kind of asymmetry is constantly top of mind. So we not only don't ever want to do anything that, would put that trust at risk, we don't even want it to even if it's defensible, kind of start to feel uncomfortable, because people really do need to feel safe. We also have all the kind of, GDPR type data rights baked into our products. We spend an enormous amount of time on security and on the sort of the data infrastructure to make sure that data is protected. WHOOP also never sells data. So the data is not the product. We are never using your data in ways that we're not disclosing. And we have very clear terms of use that are available in the app in terms of what we can and can't use your data for. As we have increased the sensitivity of the data that we collected, we've also been increasing that, privacy and security posture. And so have been working on a number of things that we're not ready to share yet behind the scenes, as we get ready for, more FDA-cleared products and more medical applications for WHOOP. So more to come on that in terms of exactly what we're working on. But really, really important to understand, with any wearable, what they're doing with their data, whether or not that data can leave. I think, it's just, where we begin every data conversation. It's, how do we make sure that we're never going to have a breach, because we take so seriously that it's, one bad event and trust is gone, and it will take another decade to rebuild that.
Well, we look forward to continuing to watch the WHOOP story and your personal career journey on using this data for preventative medicine and longevity. Emily, we've covered a lot of ground on data, AI, and the WHOOP story. Let's shift to a lightning round. What do you do for fun outside of data and AI?
I'm a runner still. I love running. I love strength training, and I really enjoy cooking. So those things kind of go together.
Yeah.
And now that I have a daughter, love cooking with her. So that's been really fun too.
Oh, very fun. Well, our Boston listeners are going to say okay, do you run on the Charles River? Where are you running?
I live in the city, so love running along the Charles, and especially out west.
Okay, nice. How about someone, famous or not, who has inspired you?
If there are any other moms listening, one of my absolute favorites is Emily Oster. She is a economist at Brown, but she wrote these books about parenting and pregnancy and all these things, called Crib Sheet and Expecting Better, and then another one called The Family Firm. And she really brings this incredibly data-driven approach to all the things that there are mom wars about, because there's so much crap and bad data and folklore about everything about parenting that just makes everybody drive themselves crazy, and just gets into what do we actually know about breastfeeding versus formula? What do we actually know about co-sleeping versus sleeping in a crib or whatever, and all these things. And just it felt like a very breath of fresh air when there's so much judgment and weird strong feelings about all these things. And so I feel like she's brought a lot of sanity to a place where there's a lot of insanity, and always appreciate people who bring rigorous data to different areas.
Definitely. We'll link to her book in the show notes. And then you can choose the last one. Either what are you most grateful for, maybe beyond the obvious of health and family, or something that you've accomplished in the last week that you are particularly proud of.
My daughter and I vibe coded a video game. And she's got 10 nieces, I have 10 nieces and nephews. So she's got 10 cousins, and a bunch of them are playing this game now, which was a really fun accomplishment for us. But it was so much fun to see her creativity come out, having these like fun and goofy ways to like let out her creativity and to like explore this. If you have little kids, highly recommend you vibe code a video game with them.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And thank you so much for being on the Data and AI Chief podcast.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate it or like it on your favorite podcast platform. And if you would like more inspiration and thought leadership, be sure to follow me on LinkedIn or visit thedataandaichief.com.